Welcome back to our panel discussion, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud in Government, sponsored by Ironbow, here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. My guests today are Greg Judge, the Deputy Director for Operations and Architecture for the CIO G6 at the Army, Andre Mendez is CIO of the International Trade Administration, part of the Commerce Department. Troy Massey is Director of Enterprise Engagements at Ironbow Technologies, and Brandon Lockhart is Director of Data Analytics at Ironbow Technologies. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And there's a key technical issue I want to get into a little bit more because it gets to the idea of how you get to this hybrid cloud in a successful way and how you get to those cost savings and how you give ultimately good service to your customers, which is what this is really all about ultimately. And that is, we talked about virtualization before the break, but there's also the topic of containerization. That's a strategy for legacy applications. I kind of liken it to putting an API around them, if you will, with the API to connect to the cloud. But that's not precisely virtualization. Troy, maybe you can talk about the nuances there and how it affects that cloud migration potential.
Yeah, actually, very similar, and you're right. It's encapsulating the application, that application that's not a candidate for a virtualization platform, and definitely not a candidate to stay behind on legacy hardware that you just can't buy hardware to update it anymore. So the idea there is that you encapsulate this application. It can still go up to a cloud. It can go from an on-prem cloud, which is traditionally where most of them are staying. A private cloud. And it can also go up to a public cloud. Similar functionality as a virtualization design.
But in many ways, it's almost like leaving you in the 1980s or 1990s when people had, well, there are still agencies that have assembler packages and COBOL packages, and they still had to have new hardware because hardware wears out. So they did a kind of encapsulation or containerization just to buy new hardware.
Absolutely. And I think Greg can talk a lot more about this because I know the military side of things, and it's a lot like if we talk about certain agencies that have systems that we've filed paperwork as civilians for a long time, those legacy systems can't just be updated in a year. And the ability to flip them over to a new system is very disruptive to the US government. So the idea that they have to stay around, but they can't be upgraded is the challenge.
It kind of keeps you in that CapEx model that everybody wants to get away from as we get toward the software-oriented world. And so, Greg, what do you do with those jovial Jupyter and Ada applications?
So what Troy just mentioned was, just struck a chord because he's absolutely 100% correct. We have mainframe applications that still run COBOL today. And so we're looking, frankly, at the cost-benefit analysis. So we've looked at containerization. Should we just put these into a cloud environment, wrapped or inside containers, to maintain current operations? But is it a better return on investment to do the necessary engineering work to completely refactor those applications to make them into a cloud-native environment where you do get the better performance, you do get the scalability, and you do get the cost savings by divesting from those legacy platforms. We're finding
and I would add maybe you even get more value over the resulting code because you can render it as microservices.
That's absolutely true. So it's an interesting point on the cost. So we're having a hard time finding people who know COBOL, for example, right? So it's not taught in colleges anymore. My son's graduating college, never heard of COBOL. So so we are putting a lot of our effort into how do we actually make these modern IT systems, and we're doing that across the portfolio. So even on some of the non-mainframe applications, we want an IT environment that's modern and scalable and adaptable to Army missions, which, as you know, they can change from day to day, month to month, week to week.
Yeah, and so Andre, that sounds like Greg's to-be state is where you are now, and then you don't have a capital expenditure situation.
That is correct, except for some networking and end-user equipment. But the problems that we are encountering now from a legacy migration standpoint have much more to do with operating system versions and database versions, because some of the legacy code was inextricably linked to specific functionality in in those platforms. And as some of the requirements, for example, from a cybersecurity standpoint, continue to evolve in terms of more sophisticated protocols, and the vendors have abandoned those platforms that are no longer updating them for those later protocols, we face a situation where we either migrate very quickly or we are out of compliance. And so, for us, it has become sort of, the mission is to really get rid of all of those legacy applications, all of those legacy environments, and select a very few environments and platforms on which we are going to be doing most of our developing going forward, and also doing all the business process re-engineering and re-architecting of the legacy applications, so that we have as few platforms to manage as possible. We are now down to basically 3 modern platforms going forward, and we still have 3 or 4 legacy platforms that they were trying to get rid of. But by the time this is all finished, we'll be relying on platforms that are entirely cloud native to start with, and that as a result offer the availability of constant vendor driven improvements and innovation, and also a very substantial amount of integration. One of the main advantages associated with one of the main vendors that I will not name, but that everybody is familiar with, that provides operating systems and office environments and cloud-based email systems, you can figure out that, right, is the fact that all of that is integrated through their authentication engines and validation engines, and they have an enormous amount of independent software vendor ISV support, so that the richness of the environment is really outstanding. And so we hope that we're going to do it over the next 18 months or so, could complete that migration, so that integration is just ubiquitous across all of our application portfolio.
Sure. And Brandon, as Andre indicated, the purpose of an environment is to run applications, but the purpose of applications is to do something with data. And now that data and applications are not bolted together anymore, it's a commodity in and of itself. What are some of the best ways to handle your resulting data in a hybrid cloud environment or a multi-cloud environment when they are not the same piece of work, let's say, as your applications?
So I think the key is, like you said, being able to decouple the data from the application. So in that point, it really comes down to the risk of the data and who needs to maintain ownership. If you're looking at public weather data versus some kind of internal data related to some military action, there's very different amount of consequences based on what happens with that data. Being able to decouple them, it allows you to keep your data on-prem, encrypted, secured, within an enclave without having to worry about external factors. If there's applications that can shift out, you have the ability built right into your system. One of the key things that I think of when I look at being able to shift up into multi-cloud is being able to take advantage of some of those cloud services. So whether it's cheaper, deeper storage, maybe it's being able to burst an analytics workload up to the cloud because you only run it for 4 or 5 months of the year. But being able to automate those tasks and orchestrate them in a manner that reduces kind of any of the human error, but at the same time gives you this flexibility to take your workloads in and out. And then even kind of more importantly is when you're looking at this cloud first journey, being able to really fix your cloud first and be able to set up this microsegmentation, being able to secure legacy applications from any kind of cross-network communication. So the cloud has really enabled this modern day adoption of technology.
Greg?
So I wanted to make a comment to what Brandon was just saying, because I think there's a really interesting point that we haven't touched on yet. But one of the things that we are looking for the cloud to enable is innovation. So once we have data decoupled from the application, we firmly believe that there will be applications that we haven't even thought of to be used for this data. We don't put it in a place to use it today because it's usually used for a specific mission. But if we put different data stores together, make them visible and accessible, applications can be developed to utilize those in a way that we probably haven't envisioned yet. The beauty of the cloud platforms also is that we can order high performance computing on demand. So if we need to implement a machine learning algorithm, for example, we can order the GPUs right off the catalog, and we can direct that against the data, and we can then turn it off and shut it down. So we can run pilots quickly, So it's a completely different enabler for us, separate necessarily from running the business of the Army, but actually running how are we going to direct the future Army and using information as not only as a strategic asset, but potentially a weapon.
So in many ways, we create our own app economies locally.
Very, very, very true.
And I guess in the Army, that would be particularly apt because as doctrine changes to more close to the line decision-making, there could be ideas for apps based on data that a captain somewhere or a sergeant somewhere knows exists, but he's not going to wait 6 years for the Army CIO office to come up with that application.
Absolutely. So there's one thing I could say about Army soldiers. They're smart, they're innovative, and they do what is necessary for the mission at hand. So if we enable them with tools, they'll come up with creative ways to solve problems. They've been doing it for years, and we will only help them do that better going forward.
Andre?
That's absolutely right. Couldn't agree more. One of the other interesting possibilities that occurs with this migration to the cloud, both from an application standpoint and a data standpoint, is that you have a unique opportunity to do business process reengineering, to actually get rid of the legacy applications that some people have become wedded to, and therefore offer resistance, because the tsunami of the cloud adoption kind of, basically trumps all of the other arguments associated with keeping this in functioning, right? And the other one is from a data standpoint, invariably in all of these agencies and with the intra-agency and intra-bureau, you have all of these data silos that were very much the predicate of the old computing models, right? And so, if, for example, at ITA, we have different business units that are doing analysis on data that they collect. And invariably, when you're looking at, for example, impacts associated with trade policy, you find that there are results that you need from this particular data set that then need to be integrated with this particular data set, because the reality is that they are targeting two different sets of data, but that the market consequences of these two sets of data are fully integrated. And so the moment that you can get rid of these silos, get into a big data lake where those relationships amongst data are further explored and laid out, you can have the sort of the engineering of multivariate analysis that beforehand was subject to multi-steps that sometimes would take weeks or months, where now, through the power of the engines, the power of the data, and the metadata associated with it, you're running queries that encompass all of these data sets in minutes, rather than having processes that rely on expertise, from the human standpoint, and take weeks or months, right? Now you couple that with artificial intelligence layer on top, and all of a sudden, not only are you running these things on a reactive basis, but you set the horses free and you start doing it from a proactive standpoint, and you really start, in a way, potentially dictating policy based on artificial intelligence analysis of multiple data sets that allow you to really, really, really become very agile. In our particular case, not only from a mission standpoint, but from a trade policy standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint, and that is really fascinating type of environment.
Yeah, and Troy, that sounds like it all points to the need for automation here, which is something we haven't discussed.
Absolutely. So at the beginning of this conversation, or this segment, we discussed legacy applications and the rationalization of those. We talked about data and where the data can decouple from the application, and the rationalization. Brandon mentioned about bursting, so there's a performance versus cheap and deep storage to rationalize the storage. And Andre hit it on the head. I think I counted 5 times when he said, analyze. You need to analyze the environment, you need to analyze what that application, that workload is supposed to do, how it behaves, make that intelligent decision of whether it belongs in a private cloud or a public cloud, but also to engage the automation piece of it. So the ability that some applications need to be highly available, and they need to be automated between one cloud or another to be able to fail over from one cloud to another. And that, again, that analysis on whether or not that application needs that automation. There's also the automation of getting them from a traditional data center over to a private cloud, public cloud. A lot of the virtualization vendors out there now have incorporated an automation piece into making that transition, that migration, very, very smooth, non-disruptive. Live migrations, the ability to automate a workload still being able to perform its duties while it's being moved to a virtual environment onto a private or public cloud.
So there's a lot of factors that would need to come into the decision of what happens with a load or a database or an application, including the cost and the bandwidth and computing capability needed, where maybe the location, even also user rights, and we'll get into identity management. Cybersecurity is a big part of all this, especially as we mash up databases for analytical purposes. So that would seem to take us beyond simple orchestration and even what we traditionally understand as automation and towards something much more intelligent. The term that's coming to my mind is robotic process automation. Is that what we're headed toward in this hybrid cloud area as a way to manage it all and make it actually happen?
If I can answer that. So I know in the Army, yeah, the answer is yes. That is really our future. More and more. We are expending significant resources to Tom's point, is to really understand the applications and the dynamics. Some of our applications have temporal requirements that today will keep them in a data center where they're currently at and located. Most of those applications won't. But that analysis is absolutely critical, and that's the one thing that we're taking a very measured approach while trying to move quickly, but actually do that analysis that is required, so that once we do move, we don't have buyer's remorse per se, and having to actually pull out and move again, redo additional engineering support, et cetera. So
sure. So the mission, in some sense, is the ultimate arbiter here.
The mission dictates everything in the Army, yes. And the cost.
And it's funny you mentioned the cost, because there are a lot of hidden costs that we haven't covered yet. And part of that is how a cloud vendor makes their money. It's egress of data. So just moving to an application to a cloud may work great for performance, but different applications behave in different ways, and some are very chatty. You need to pull data down constantly from that application for it to do its job. Every time you're pulling data down, you're getting cost. So that analyzing whether or not that application makes sense to go up there is also a cost perspective, not just a performance perspective. There's been several cases where it costs them 3 times to 30 times more to put it in the cloud than to just upgrade their on-prem.
All right, on that unhappy note, we're going to take a short break. We'll take a short break, and then I want to explore that a little bit more, but we are at the time here for our commercial break. This is a panel discussion, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud in Government, sponsored by Ironbow here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.